Hello, and thank you for making me so welcome, both in Johannesburg and here again, even more so in Cape Town. It was very interesting, actually. I was listening to the song playing in the background, and Karen turned to me as it went into the South African portion of the video and said, "They're saying VUCA." And the reason for that is that actually my talk is about, the first part of it, this acronym, VUCA, which stands for Volatile, Uncertain, Complex and Ambiguous. Now this is a term that was coined by the US Defense Department at the end of the Cold War. For 40-odd years, the Defense Department and their strategic thinking had all been very bipolar. It was a very black and white world. It was us and them. Everything was very simple. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, of the Iron Curtain, the dissolution of the USSR and so on, they suddenly found themselves in a very different world. And they coined this term because for them, the threats and to US defense could come from anywhere now. It was very volatile. Suddenly things would come up that they weren't expecting. It was very uncertain. It was very unpredictable. You know, it's almost like, yeah, we knew where we were with the Ruskies, and then all of a sudden, you know, we didn't know what was going to happen next. It's very complex. Geopolitics switched from being bipolar to a much more diverse web of relationships around the world. And it was ambiguous. Who's our friend, who's our foe? And this is still true today for all of us. We're living in a world where there's a huge amount of volatility. Certainly for me, coming out from the UK at the beginning of the week, I'm going on holiday for a bit. I'll be going back home in 2 weeks' time. I can't predict what I'm going to go back to in the UK at the moment. It's a very complex world. Yeah? So social networks, all of these things have brought so many more aspects of the world to our doorstep. And it's very ambiguous in terms of what's happening. And we can relate that directly to the world of brands and the world that marketers like yourselves have to operate in. So when I looked at the top 100 this year, I said, gracious, there's so much change going on. Charles said there's a 7% growth this year. That's great. But actually, 7% is just an average of what's happening to the top 100 brands. We've got 9 fell out, 9 new ones that came in, you saw those. And we've got change where some brands have doubled their value and others, their value has collapsed. So a huge amount of volatility in brand value around the world. Some of that is coming from the uncertainty of unpredictable events. You know, that we don't know what's happening with Brexit, we don't know what's going to happen with tariffs between the US and China, and what impact that's going to have on the rest of the world. So brands are trying to operate in this space, and it's very, very hard for them to be able to predict. It's a more complex world. Charles gave the example of Amazon as an ecosystem brand, but all brands are living in a much more interconnected world. All brands will either need to be ecosystems or to join in partnership with other brands. You can't exist in isolation anymore. You have to have partnerships to protect you and to exploit all the emerging opportunities. So that's a fundamental, and that just makes your job as a marketer much, much harder, because you can't just think about my brand, but what about all those brands that I've got to be in partnership with? And what do consumers think of those? And finally, we come to this point about ambiguity. In a world where even something as simple as a car, you know, we all thought we knew if you made cars, you were in the market for cars. It's very simple. No, today you're in the market for mobility. I, as a consumer, can choose to buy a car, to rent a car, to get a car when I need one on a ride-hailing app. I can choose to share a car. I can choose to actually have a car system in the city where I'll just find out where the nearest one is and pop into that and then leave it somewhere else afterwards. So Oh, is it going to be a self-driving car? Is it going to be an autonomous car? Is it going to be an electric car? So all these factors are changing, to give you that one example, the definition of what our market is. And that makes it harder and harder for all of us to draw the boundaries and to understand, where do I need to compete? Who am I competing with? What do consumers really want from me? So in that world of uncertainty and ambiguity, it gives you insight into a whole variety, as we said, something like 400 different categories of brands that we've studied. So in your world, if you're trying to understand the new realities, BrandZ is a great source of inspiration, to look for parallels, to look for ideas about what other brands are doing, how other brands are succeeding, what qualities you need. So, big data for the challenges of the VUCA world. Let's just dig a little bit more into that top 100. And I've got a complementary chart to the one that Charles showed you. Now, if we go back, and this one just goes back to 2012, and we look at the big companies in the world, the Standard & Poor's 500, and we look at their enterprise value. So that is the value of the company as described by stock price minus any debt. Okay, so that's what we call enterprise value. And at that point, 18% of that were fixed assets that were on the books of those companies. Other intangibles were about 45%. And the brands that we were measuring in that top 100 that you've seen, for example, they were contributing about 37% of that enterprise value. So still a very significant contribution. But two things have happened over the last decade, well, less than a decade. First of all, the fixed assets of a business have actually halved in proportion. There's a huge amount of, particularly through technology, patents, intellectual property, the skills of people in those companies. That's where the value of those businesses is. And in particular, the ability of companies to translate all of that intangible asset into brand value, which is now proportionately accounting for more than 40% of the total enterprise value of brands. So brands are hugely important to businesses. And managing that asset, that brand value that's contributing to stock price, and investing in it to make sure that your company is delivering 41% is the most important thing that we all collectively can be doing. And not all companies do it as well as others, as we've seen. So 7% overall increase in brand values in the global top 100 this year, but a huge disparity if we just group companies by their main area of business, the category that they're working in. We look at the luxury brands in our top 100, they're contributing 29% more than they did last year. So despite, what some people have thought about, there's always hard economic times as well. It's about uncertainty, yes, and maybe a little bit about the rich getting richer, and they like their luxury brands and products, their Dior's and Chanel's and Louis Vuitton's. So luxury brands doing very well. Unfortunately, none of the luxury brands in South Africa are big enough to get onto the top 30 in South Africa, let alone the top 100 in the world. So South Africa, as Charles said, a decline of 13%. Well, part of that is the makeup of the brands that we have here that are big and strong. And actually, 8 of those top 30 brands are either beers or banks. And globally, those are categories that are having a tough time. So you can see here, 6% down in value on average for our beer brands in the top 100, 8% down for banks in our top 100. So it's not surprising when 44% of the value last year in South African top 30 was in those two categories, that it's declining. Now the other group that I looked at in the South African ranking, there's quite a lot of brands, is retail. And we'd look over here and we'd say, well, that's fine, look. globally, retail's up 25%. Except 3/4 of that growth is Amazon. Okay. So 144 billion of growth for Amazon, or something, sorry, not quite that, sorry, but over 100 billion in growth for Amazon has meant that actually if you take that away, it's much more down here in the average area. Just around 6% growth for retailers overall. But you do have a changing retail environment here, and there are brands that are taking advantage of it. And those brands will be more protected from the overall declines in brand value. So, volatility by brand, by sector, uncertainty and unpredictability. It's true that we have that uncertainty and unpredictability, but when we look at the global brand list, we did see, as Charles said, some really good examples of brands that have grown. And growth, actually, when we look at it, in the end, I can find growing brands in any of the sectors. I can find a beer brand that's growing. I can find a bank that's growing in value. There's just less of them. But we can find them in all sectors. And we can also find them achieving that growth through a variety of strategies. So in uncertain and unpredictable times, you've really got to look around and find what is going to work for me. There's no generic rules. So these brands over here, Instagram, Dior, Chipotle, Under Armour, Geico Insurance in the US, they seem to be growing because they were doing what they had always done, doing more of it and doing it better. So they were reaching new consumers with the same offer, the same basic fundamental brand. They were refreshing that brand, finding new ways to talk about themselves. And they were reminding consumers of what was already positively stored in their brains, but just keeping it there and reminding consumers of those strengths that they had, the assets that they built up over the years. On this side, we've got some brands probably doing both of these things. It's just a matter of balance. But brands over here are changing themselves as well. They're innovating their offer and they're extending what they're doing. So we've seen how Amazon extending what they can offer into entertainment, into physical retail, into business services. But you've also got a brand like Shiseido that was on the ranking for some time, went down and down, was getting tired, and so on, and fell off the ranking about 5 years ago, has come back into the ranking, is growing again on the back of highly innovative products, so you know, some very clever Japanese technology being put into the cosmetics and beauty sector by them. So consumer products and businesses like Adobe and Salesforce, who are extending what they do. So Adobe, most of us, if we think of Adobe, we think of, oh yeah, it's that clever thing that helps me edit pictures or create graphics. Yeah, no, actually now it's a whole data management platform. Will help you with all your digital advertising needs. And it goes way beyond that as well. So innovating and extending, that might be right for you. Reaching, refreshing and reminding, that might be where you should be putting more of your investment. So understanding your brand, understanding your consumers, and understanding your market, all the insights that you can get will help drive the potential for growth. And it is a complex world. So our ecosystem brands like Amazon, brands that when we divided up the top 100 had 5 or more areas of business that we were measuring them in, ended up being 4 times bigger than the average of the other brands with 3, 2 or 1 areas of business. But more importantly, they're growing 10 times faster. So their growth rate, an average of 19% compared to just 1 or 2% on average for brands in these other areas. Now, okay, there are some brands who simply won't be able to operate in lots of categories. Doing one thing well can still lead to you being a very big and very successful brand. But in those cases, even McDonald's, now in partnership with Uber Eats, to deliver McDonald's. their technology. So when you go into a McDonald's store and you order from touchscreens and so on, they needed partnerships to develop all those technologies and deliver them seamlessly to consumers. Payment technologies. So they are embedding themselves very effectively in an ecosystem. Some of the biggest risers in the financial area aren't the banks, as we saw, they're declining, but payment companies and networks, people like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, we've predicted it's the number 12 brand on the ranking. We think that will likely get into the top 10 next year on the rates of growth that these brands are showing. So it's those brands, and what do? They help connect brands, they help seamlessly integrate your brand through payment into the ecosystem of the consumer's life. And ambiguity. So who would have thought, even just a couple of years ago, that Amazon would get into physical stores? But here this year in the UK, they're opening up 10 shops across the UK, physical stores, where because of their partnerships, and they're 58% dependent on small and medium enterprises that sell through the Amazon platform. So those partnerships are really important to them. So they've actually said, okay, let's open a shop window to a selection of our top-rated partners, so you can actually go into a physical store and look at scooters or cosmetics or other things that you can buy on Amazon. And one might say maybe it's a little bit of tokenism to move back into the high street, having destroyed most of it, but nevertheless, it does show you that you can't, sort of put a boundary around what a brand could or should be doing. So ambiguity can be constructive and helpful, and you can change what you produce or what you sell or the service that you provide. If it's true to your brand, then go and do it. Okay, so that's our lessons from the top 100. But BrandZ isn't the only study that we do, and as Charles said, we're very proud that we come to countries like to South Africa and look at what South Africa has to offer the world. So we have a study from our sister business in WPP, VML Y&R's BAV group, run a study now called Best Countries. So it's been running now for a couple of years. We interview about 21,000 people around the world, about 80 different countries. We actually only go to 36 countries to talk to people, but it's about that wider set of 80 countries across the world. And we interview them about their attitudes to those countries on a whole range of things, 65 different attributes, but we group them into these 8 themes. So we look to see whether is that country highly skilled? Is it open for business? Is it full of growth opportunities? So that's entrepreneurship. Is there a great quality of life? Yeah? Is it a good place to raise a family? Is it safe? Is it friendly? What about the citizenship? Is it progressive? Is it equal? Are there rights enshrined for the citizen? And then we look at cultural influence. So is it strong on things like entertainment, fashion, all of those areas? Is it open for business? Tricky one, this one. Is there low corruption? Is there a reliable, trustworthy infrastructure? Is it powerful? Does it have a big military? Is it very rich? And then slightly more minor functions, is it a great place to go and have adventures? And does it have wonderful heritage? I think Italy ranks #1 on heritage. It's just like full of ruins. has this advantage. Now these are the percentages that you see on here. We took all of the attributes, we grouped them into these themes, and then we look to see how well each of those attitudes related to the success of the country, and we measured the success of the country on GDP per capita having allowed for parity purchasing. Okay? So it's success in a relatively economic sense. Yeah? And these are the relative importance for each of those areas. And interestingly, my colleagues have told me that run the study, if they had been doing it a few years ago, they would have said power, would have been the thing that dictated, 10, 20 years ago, power, military and economic might would have dictated a lot of that. But we're in a very different world now, and actually a whole variety of factors come into play. So we put all of those scores together, and we end up with a global ranking of all the countries. Last year, South Africa was 39th ranked in the world. This year, up 2 places. Yes! Number 37 out of 80. And just a smidgen more good news. You're top in Africa. So you're now ranked ahead of Egypt on these things. And think of all the ruins there. So they've got an inbuilt advantage. So, well done. You're in a band of countries that include places like Mexico, Vietnam, Malaysia, and some European countries like Croatia. So, strong and successful, lots of strengths in your country, and those are rooted around being a distinct and dynamic place. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at some of those strengths. And not a surprise, number 1 of your strengths, you are 5th in the world for sport. So your athletes, golfers, rugby players, cricketers, all those swimmers, all those people have taken the South African flag with pride to all corners of the earth. People recognise not just that, but also the cultural embracing of sport here. So the hosting of World Cups and all those other fantastic sporting events has really helped demonstrate to the world your friendly passion for sport. And that's a really dynamic quality in and of itself. But added to that, we've got your number 9 for being unique, a very distinctive country. 13th for being distinctive. 20th for being culturally significant. You have a place in developing the culture of the world. People see that, what has gone on in South Africa over the last 20, 30 years. Your story is well known around the world. It's great for studying and starting a career as well, actually, for a lot of people. So that's great. So we put some of these things together. This isn't actually a separate attribute, but it's a separate theme that we pull out of the data. And you are number 10 in this sort of overall summary of dynamism in the world, being for movers and shakers. So that's great. And interestingly, Charles said you're 31st in the world for GDP, but you're ranked number 22 for a place that people want to invest in. Now, maybe not so good. When we look at all the other countries that are doing so well, and what's keeping you out of this top 10, there are, of course, some downsides. And we talked about some of the attributes that we're measuring. And unfortunately, you don't have a great reputation for being open for business, for having honest practices. You're downrated on things like crime and corruption. And that is probably, so in one sense I was surprised you're still strong on the investment score, because people see it as a lovely country. They want to come and work here, but there are, and they want to come and invest here. But there are those factors holding you back. So there is a balance of scores. As we've said, it's a VUCA world. You've got your own little VUCA events happening right in Cape Town at the moment. We hope that obviously we will continue to move forward together, but there are these hiccups and downturns. And it shows what South Africa as a brand needs most now is that stability and security to offer to businesses across the world. Because all those other qualities really do suggest to me, and the analysts that work on this project, that these lovely South African brands would be welcome in the rest of the world. Yeah? You've got great qualities here, and most of all, you've got real distinctiveness. Your people are very diverse, But you look at it all together, the thing that stands out, you're very different, you know, and in a good way. You're friendly. Friendliness actually went up 11 places this year for South Africa. So even in adversity, good at smiling, and that attitude can be well known across the world. So what brands need to be doing is saying there are opportunities out there in the rest of the world. We would be welcome. We need to take our fantastic national identity, we need to take the dynamism of sport, but also the way that we embrace sport, so much better than the sledging of the Australians, I always find. So, rather supercilious, aren't they, the Australian sportspeople? And you're just basically full of enthusiasm and energy. And if brands can take that and translate it, Nando's is a great example of a brand that's taken a South African identity and exported that as part of their brand around the world. Other brands can do a little bit of that, learn some of those lessons, then who knows how successful you might be. I'm just going to end with one little bit controversial slide that somebody picked out from the data for me. They said, oh, what about wine? The 12th biggest wine producer in the world, but the perception of us as a wine as a wine producing country ranks you down at 36. And I said, well, I can't even think of 35 other wine producing countries. How can that be? But you know, this is the difference between perception and reality. And you have the brand strengths in BrandZ South Africa to bridge that gap. Your job as marketers is to find ways to take all the great things about your brand, all the great things about BrandZ South Africa, and drive those things together on the international stage, so that maybe next time we'll flip this round. Number 12 in actuality, maybe we'll go number 10, number 9, number 8, because the perception will be lifting all the time. So thank you very much for your time this morning.